Morning again, guys. Well, if you weren't here last week, just not a huge recap, but because there's quite a bit there. So if you weren't here and you didn't catch last week's podcast yet, please go back and do so. That's really going to explain out a lot of things as far as what came out of the sabbatical, where we're heading as a church. We're talking a lot about educate biblical imagination, and looking at the life of Christ, and we're going to be really centering into the life of Christ. And if you don't know what I mean by that phrasing, please make sure you check out the podcast from last week and get caught up, because it does really set the foundation for where we're digging in. But we really are going to be just in a long season of imagining Christ, learning Christ, living Christ, with the goal of not just getting head knowledge, where we could pass some kind of biblical trivia test, but how to have a more intimate, personal relationship with Jesus by digging in deeper into Him. And there's a lot of different ways that we are going to be doing that. Again, the Living Word drama, I think, is going to be fabulous for those who go to the drama. Jenny and I are working on our schedule because we'd like to go be a part of that as well. I think that would be a great opportunity, and that's going to really kind of passionate, and I've heard great reviews on that, the outdoor drama, go through what we're used to seeing when it goes to the Gospels and the stories that we find there. We're also going through on Wednesday nights, we just started this past week, going through the TV show The Chosen, which is a rather unique television show when it comes to the life of Christ, and it's a lot, again, of that educated biblical imagination that we talked about, and I'll actually bring that in a little bit into today's study as well. But we had a group, I think about 11 or 12 of us, Wednesday night, and again, the conversation afterwards, I loved, just to be able to share with each other our thoughts and to be able to dream a little bit together and to share with one another, dig into the Word together was awesome. But one of the things that we're going to be doing by far is on Sunday mornings digging into Jesus, primarily by going through the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Amazement, where we just see a world touched, a world turned upside down, world being explored in a way that we don't normally look at it. We see story after story after story and testimony after testimony of people being amazed by Jesus and also misunderstanding Jesus. We find the two times that Jesus is amazed himself. There's two times that Jesus was amazed at two different things. So we're going to look at what does Jesus get amazed by. So there's a lot there to dig into. So that's why I want to start diving into today, and we'll do that as you naturally assume you would, by getting into the scripture and going to the first chapter of John. So if you would, let's go ahead and get our Bibles out. There's Bibles in the baskets around the room underneath the chairs if you need it. YouVersion's up and running. But the first chapter of John is a great overview. It's a great appetizer for what we're going to be getting into in Luke. So I do want to spend some time there today, because it's just masterful. It's beautiful. As you're turning there, let me just share some things that you may or may not already know as far as the Gospels and some of the things that will come onto our plate as we go. The first Gospel written was the Gospel Mark. It was about somewhere between 65, 75 AD, which is a very interesting time. That's the time that Rome destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. There's a ton of interesting facts with that we'll get into when we are talking about Jesus taking and prophesizing that was going to happen a few decades later. But within that means everything was turned upside down within the Jewish community and within the Messianic Jewish community as far as Christians, people that have assigned themselves into a life of Christ. And so they've had the teaching of the apostles of what Jesus said and what Jesus did, but there started to grow an outcry to get it down on paper for the generations to come. That we've already lost some apostles at this standpoint. Things weren't necessarily looking good. There's a lot of challenge. So Mark was the first one to really pick up the mantle and write down the stories of Peter into his gospel, as he was an apprentice or a disciple of Peter, and putting those things out. About 10 years after that is when we get the second two, when we get Matthew and Luke about the same time, which are kind of interesting as well, because as Mark's gospel circulated, it's pretty evident that Matthew and Luke had access to those, because they kind of followed the same outline. It's kind of where Mark set the outline, and the other two said, yeah, let me present it to those same kind of stories, those same testimonies, the things that I remember, the things that I share, from different perspectives. For instance, Matthew was clearly writing to Jewish believers, and Luke was clearly writing to Gentiles. And we'll talk about their backgrounds and what some of those purposes are as we go along. But they generally somewhat resemble, just from, again, some different tidbits and some different stories within that. And I always thought, it would actually, this talk about biblical imagination, what a kick it would be to watch Matthew read Mark the first time. Would that be kind of cool? I just was thinking about that the other day. It's just like, what would that be like to be reading through that, or the other followers, like your own story, and what that must have been like. Well, John was later. John comes around 90 or 100 AD. He's finished pretty much most of his ministry. For a long time, he was based out of Ephesus, but now he's been sent to the prison island of Patmos. This is where he writes his gospel, as well as the revelations that he receives. And John is kind of a written out collection of the sermons that he's been telling all his life, of the stories that he's been sharing for eons. And there's some attributed possibly to his disciples that added in to his gospel. But most of it is the same things that he has said a million times over. Like if you really think about it, by the time he wrote this, Peter's been gone for 30 years. And John's been he's the only disciple that didn't get martyred, that died of an old age. And so for him to be the last apostle in Ephesus, and you're thinking about how they must have revered him. What would it be like for John just to walk down the street at that point? What would it be like to be an apostle but be the last one for so long, the last one entrusted with that message? I mean, the only thing I could think of, and again, because Star Wars is great, if you think of Luke, like old man Luke, yes, we all know that Leia was Jedi as well. We all know about Rey. We're all up to par on everything that we need to know in Star Wars. We said, if not, we'll stop this series and go into that, but I'm not doing that. That'd be horrible. That'd be horrible. Love you. It's one thing to joke about your wife in the sermon, it's another. But anyways, to the universe, if you watch the movies at all, I mean, he's a legend. They wonder where he's at. Like if you see Luke, you're just all dumbfounded. That's what it would be like for John. And he's been spending decades sharing these stories with people just bewildered. And when you bring that into it and read John, it's really quite fascinating to imagine it from that perspective. He knows, as you read this, he knows what people aren't going to quite get at this point. So he's going to add some things in to be able to explain it without the reader asking the questions that he's heard a billion times over. He knows what gets a chuckle. He knows what is kind of a driving point within it. So this really is a very defined presentation guided by the Holy Spirit. And in this particular section, especially this first chapter, it is masterful to look at from two different standpoints. One, we lose this in the English translation, but chapter 1 is two different songs broken up by one little paragraph about John the Baptist. And those are the songs we're going to focus on. So if it sounds somewhat poetic, or if it sounds like there's like a rhythm to it, it doesn't quite make sense to just a paragraph, that's because they were originally songs. They're songs that John had taken and taught on so much that he just kind of breaks into lyrics sometimes. And it's really kind of cool. There's going back many years, Jenny and I were at used to go to these CBA conferences, these international conferences for booksellers when we had the bookstore. And the winter one, it always seemed like there was one author that was everywhere. I mean, just everywhere. To every booth, speaking, walking around within 5 feet at you at any time. I remember one time I was there by myself and texting Jenny and asked her, do you dare me to tackle Tim LaHaye? From like left behind, he's just everywhere he went. And one year we were there, and the guy that was everywhere was Brennan Manning. And I don't know if you know Brennan Manning or not, but a lot of people do. And he's a unique bloke. He's just a very unique guy in his mannerisms, his talk, everything. And even more so when he's actually speaking. As we would go, was doing a morning devotional type thing. And he had Irish blood in him, and he's a previous alcoholic, and a lot of times he just kind of seemed like a drunk Irish guy in a bar, just da-da-da-da-da-da, like mentality going on. And he would be like halfway through a thought, and he'd break into this like old Irish lyric poem, then walk around stage like sing a song, and we're like, Okay, I guess we wait till the rest of the sentence, and then he gets done, and he goes back. And I almost kind of picture that with John, with bringing these songs in to his teaching, just because the way that it flows, and he defines things, even in this first paragraph, beautifully, that are deeply intense, such as divinity, humanity, revelation, sacrifice, in a way that is as simple as we could possibly come close to understanding any of it. It was so powerful and so eloquently done. This I just learned recently, that when the early church referred to his letter by a symbol, the symbol was an eagle, because nothing had flown higher, nothing had flowed smoother, and had more power to it than John's letter. So it really was deeply intense. So with that, with the red and whistle a little bit, let's go into John chapter 1 and see what that we find together. And again, I know a lot of us have been through this before, but there's a lot more to go as well. So in chapter 1, verse 1, it says this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Now again, imagine this is the way John's doing. It's just like, in the beginning was the Word, right? And the Word was with God. He's just singing this song of just complexity in such a beautiful and simple way. Now, we have talked about this before, and again, we know that the W is capitalized because it's in place of Jesus' name, right? Jesus was God, God was Jesus. But I want to go a little bit deeper this time with you in some of the original language and some of the things that John was doing here that also apply into our lives today. So we're going to do a little bit of original language study into this particular standpoint, because when he's talking about word, what he's talking about is logos. That's the word that's used here. And in the Greek, it means word. And Chris, can I get you help with that? Thanks. So putting logos up, it just means word. So, okay, that makes sense. That's why he used it within it. But logos could be defined different ways depending on what words was mirrored in with it. And when we're looking at the Greek, it's tied to a word called memra, which we'll put that up for you too for note takers. So and with memra, it means the expression of God. Okay, so that, from our understanding, makes sense. Right? Jesus is the expression of God. He is God. And it's a good thing. So we see what John is trying to do here. The challenge is, during Jesus' time, this has been abused. You remember how, like, a lot of times we pick a kind of a key word and we define it. So we have a common definition because all of us define words a little bit differently. The same thing happens especially with languages like Greek and Hebrew that are so rich with definition. And they've been twisted by different false religions during this time. For instance, with the Gnostics. The Gnostics take and talk about Jesus as logos, as the expression of God, because in certain sections of Gnostics, because there's two different trains of thoughts within it, but one of the prominent of the two was that Jesus wasn't man. He wasn't human. He was just an expression of God. He's a vision of God. So if he just left it at the word, then we could also have some heresy brought into that because people around him are defining that word differently. And we see in verse 14, he actually just hits that head on. So we know that's in his mindset. There's another group at this time, I'll make sure I say it correctly. I'm still not going to say this correctly. Herodias is another group that followed a 6th century theologian from that time, someone who was a little bit more of a philosopher, and he defined the vision of God, or the expression of God, as hate, as anger, as war, as that's just the way the world is, that it's a universal principle. So if he was coming in and saying hate and war is the expression of God in this, then it's a completely different impact on how that ends up working out, with the audience that he's talking to. So he has to define it more. And what we find is that with the verbiage that he uses, instead of the Greek, he uses the Hebrew version of logos, which also means word, but is not tied to the expression of God. It's tied to the word debar, Chris, if you could put that up. Debar, which has two definitions to it, word and deed. So we still got the logos word part, but we also have deed. And they actually go together. That's not two separate definitions. In other words, the definition he's using is this is the expression of God. Okay, this is God himself, and what God says happens. What Jesus does is truth. It's a very strong statement of who Jesus is that others tend to try to water down to a comfortable understanding or to their purposes. But he says that doesn't match up. We need the fullness of who Jesus truly is. And this is the Word. He defines this into particular bookends, as you can see in verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, being the exact same words as the beginning of Genesis, is not an accident. John has access to Genesis. When he says at the end of verse 2 that he was in the beginning with God, it's not an accident. He's taken it back to the divinity. He's taken it back to the Trinity of our God that they have been trying to separate out from him. And so we find that there's this deeper understanding than what the people had been embracing, that we find that literally the Word of God is Jesus, and that as he goes through in verse 3, all things are made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. We've talked about this before. In other words, when God said, "Let there be light," that's words. Light was created through who? Through the Word, through Jesus. Nothing was created that was not created through Jesus. Everything within creation is created through Jesus. From the very beginning, they are one and the same. He is the Word, and the creation happens through him. And so that's going to become a very important point here as we get into another paragraph. And then he talks about the life and the light of man. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And again, the light is going to be a massive, we're not going to go through all of John at this point, but the light is a massive theme for John to continue to use that as far as his light in the darkness. And he's really kind of embracing us to go deeper into that light, not just deeper, he's actually inviting us to go into the fullness of that light. And trusting in the power to be able to burn at that level is incredible that God lets us do that. I was playing with my phone, and I was kind of going through some of this a little bit. You guys, you won't be able to see this. But all you guys have that little thing that dims the light on your phone, right? There he is. I don't know, let's do a survey. Who usually keeps that at less than 50%? Most of us? I do. I'm usually like about 40% because I use my phone more than most 50-year-old middle-aged men, and because the power went out by the end of the day if I don't. And so for me, I usually keep it in that general ballpark of things. So it's kind of dim. I don't know how long I'll be able to do that because the eyes continue to fail more and more versus being able to see things so clearly, right? Jeremiah, you're laughing. You making fun of me over there? She is? Oh my gosh. I know. I have that on. I have it on for a purpose. Off. On. Okay. Now on. Okay, so... well, the thing I really wanted for this is I wanted this little bar to adjust this. It'd be easy to see, but it doesn't. Oh, well. I would contest that a lot of us are living on 40% when it comes to Jesus. And I would even put out there that the level of anxiety and stress and fear and relational bumps that we go through are because we're living at 40%, because we're afraid of going full bar, because the amount of power that it takes to go full bar is something we don't understand. We just simply don't comprehend that. But here he's saying he is the light, he's got the power, it's covered. Go full bar. And the more that we do this 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, 99%, the more we get a lukewarm version of Christianity in our own lives, versus what we are created for as children of the risen King that he calls us to. So in the light of that, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, right? What a beautiful song it says. And the last line, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, becomes the key sentence that defines Jesus' life. That he is the light, he comes into the darkness. Man, I remember times I've spent at least 2 hours in this room. Most of this is when we had the smaller room, chasing out every ounce of light with trash bags and duct tape over the windows, over the door seams, and you turn off the lights, and there's always a little bit of light someplace, so you have to duct tape that up and everything. And you turn on one candle in the middle of that, and just everything changes. He's the light. and he shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The darkness comes against it constantly, all through his ministry. If you look at the trajectory of Jesus' ministry, Mike and I were talking about this a little bit before church today. If you look at the trajectory of Jesus' ministry, he starts out solo in the synagogues. Things are actually somewhat uncomplicated at that point. He calls in followers like we talked about last week. He educates them. His ministry grows hugely. But long about the time he says, this is what it means to follow me. We see this trajectory of the rest of his life of more and more people walking away, all the way to the point that Jesus is alone on the cross, which means Jesus was getting more and more lonely as his journey continued for you and me. But the darkness, no matter how much it came across it, did not have an ounce of being able to succeed in doing its goal. What does that mean for your life? What does that mean for your life? So then we have this paragraph here, right, 6 through 8. It's about John. It's kind of interesting that John the Apostle talks about John the Baptist 3 different times in the first 2 chapters. And so there's a reason for that. I'm not going to necessarily get into that today. We're going to be digging into John the Baptist more next week, but I do find it interesting that he stops the song, tells us Jesus didn't happen in a vacuum. He was part of a plan that was announced centuries and centuries before, that everyone knew that he fulfilled, that John the Baptist fulfilled. And then he goes into another song, the Song of Incarnation. And in this one, just to spare your ears, I won't sing it, but I will say it. He goes back to the concept of light, and not just light, but the true light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, who gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God, but of the will of God. So he continues back into that light aspect and now calls it the true light. Why would we have to call it the true light if there's not false lights? If there's not things in this world that tries to keep us into the gray, the things that keep us back into that lukewarm, the things that give us a little bit of a comfort zone, but are not the fullness of the light, the things that are at the 40% instead of the 100%. There are a lot of things that we hold on to that offer a little bit of light. We got some money from the government we didn't expect. Woo, a little bit of light, right? Someone I thought hated me took and sent me a card this week. Woo, a little bit of a light. Well, I got through the week without completely blowing it, even though I did go off on a couple people. And so a little bit of light in my anger. That's better than it used to be. There's a lot of comfort zone areas that we can come into that he also refers to here, but are not the true light. And you and I are going for what? The true light. When we were watching The Chosen the other night, there's a scene in the first episode. And by the way, I'm not going to say spoiler alert on any of these. This is my thought process at this point. This series has been out for like a year and a half, 2 years for the first season. You had the opportunity to watch it with us Wednesday night. So if you didn't see it, then I ruined it for you. That's just the way it goes now. Give me plenty of chances. But I will say this. I've watched the first episode, sections of it, 4 times already, and it just gets keeping deeper. So I really don't think I'm spoiling anything. Don't skip it just because I talk about it a little bit. But there's a scene in it with Nicodemus, the teacher of teachers. And he is, pretty top rank within the synagogue, within leaders. And he is already, before meeting Jesus, having questions. He thinks. He's a thinker. And as we know, Nicodemus eventually comes to be a Christian himself at the end of Jesus' life. But at this point, he hasn't even met him yet. It really hasn't come up. And he's talking about to his wife some of his concerns, some of the things that he's struggling with. Now, his wife is an encourager to say, please shut up, please stop doing that, and be the role that you're supposed to be. And so he calls her over, and he says, look in this mirror. They're staying at somebody else's house. And he says, look in this mirror. He goes, what do you see? And they show it, and she goes, I see nothing. It's a blur. It's like foggy. She's like, the glass is so cheap, I don't even know why they made that thing, kind of down in it and whatnot. He goes, that's what I wonder sometimes, if it's like that with God and us. Like, what if we're just seeing the foggy version? What if there's more? What if there's something greater? What if there's something more impactful? And she goes, will you stop speaking foolishness and borderline blasphemy and get your stuff to go, because they're going to a party where he's supposed to be like the guest of honor type thing. But he's struggling with it. And as we watch it today, we know he's right. We know when it comes to just counting on the law, which we're getting into here, there's a poor reflection aspect of it instead of the fullness of the intimacy that we're not waiting just for heaven for, but that he invites us to now, that he provided for us through Jesus Christ, that there's this better image, there's this true light that you and I can have that many of us are settling for less. And that's just not what he wants for you. It's not what he wants for me. It's not what he wants for his church, and it's not what he wants for this world. As he talks about it throughout this, and he's talking about some of the law and some of the other aspects of the thing, the law is a poor reflection of it that can point out what sin is. It can point out what the struggle is, but it can't solve it. But the true light can. And that's what we're invited into. The second part within this is just, it should just dumbfound us, but I don't think it does because we see it so much. He came to his own. They didn't receive him. They didn't understand him. Came to the world did not know him. These are people that should know him, isn't it? None of the world was created outside of through him in the Word. Nothing. No tree, no bush, no dog, no nothing was created except for through Jesus. His very own creation says, I don't know who you are. That's kind of jacked up. That shouldn't be that way. When he comes to his people, he is the life that we are created through. We are created in God's image. We should absolutely be responding to the Christ, and we didn't get it. He goes to his hometown. He goes to his own people, not just all of humanity, but God's chosen people who have devoted themselves and taken great pride in being God followers, and they have no clue about the Messiah, even though everything was presented for them. This is called the motif of misunderstanding, the persistence of misunderstanding when it comes to Jesus. When we look at Jesus talking to Nicodemus and saying, you must be born again, and he goes, how is that even possible? How can I climb into my mother's womb again and be born again? It's a motif of misunderstanding. He doesn't get it because Jesus is spiritual, and we keep looking at things through a worldly eyes. When he goes and talks to the woman at the well and says, can I have a cup of water? What's her response? What, you don't have a bucket? And why are you talking to me? I'm a Samaritan. I'm a woman. I'm hiding from my own people by coming out in the middle of the day. Why are you even speaking to me? It's because she's seeing things through a worldly standpoint, and there's a motif of misunderstanding. This is a consistency through the Gospels, and especially through John's Gospel. John has a fascination, even with his own misunderstanding, when it comes to who Jesus is, what Jesus says, and what the truth of that true life is. And it continues today, does it not? Does it not continue? The teachers always talked about people coming to learn, and Jesus is the one that's raised up as people keep coming to learn. They just don't get what he's saying, and they just keep he's a misunderstood teacher is basically the nickname that John brings into this aspect. I'm going to have to die. I'm going to be abused. I'm going to be crucified. I'll raise again on 3 days. They're like, motif of misunderstanding, because we limit what we expect from God because of our own 40% instead of the fullness of what Jesus has for us. We'll continue into verse 14. Now, before I go into 14, in this section, we see one of the things that John does that's unique to his gospel. I heard one person refer to as John's whispers. That John, again, has done this so many times, he knows where he needs to interject a little something that's not really part of the story, but you as the listener would benefit from knowing this sidebar. That's why I call it, is whenever I do my sidebars. So he whispers in stories, and you'll see it often, but this is the first example that we have. I'll point out when we get there. 14 says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Again, remember, this is a song. This is a lyric. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Whisper. Off to the side, John bore witness about him and cried out, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. That's his whisper. Then he goes back to singing. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. So as I said, in verse 14, he hinted at the Gnostics earlier. Now it's just straight up in their face. The Word was flesh. Period. No one's going to misunderstand my logos. The Word was flesh. He was 100% divine, 100% man, and he focuses on that throughout his word. He talks about Jesus being tired, talks about him being hungry, talks about him being thirsty, talks about him bleeding, talks about him groaning from within. He talks about his death. He talks about in the later days when he was resurrected back from the dead. We talked about last week. Have you ever really thought and considered most people did not recognize Jesus after the resurrection until they heard him call his name? He broke bread in front of them. He showed them his scars. That visions, ghosts don't have scars. And so here he wants to make sure we know that it is flesh, but even though he is flesh, we have seen his glory. And there's three ways that he talks about us seeing his glory as we go into this time together going through Luke. We see it through his person, his gentleness, his fire, his patience, his heart, his love. We talk about it through his works, the way that he acts in those works, the way that, again, the world's turned upside down, the way that the least becomes the first, the way that he cares for people, the way that he sacrifices for people. We see through his works. So we talked about last week, there were four miracles that the rabbis considered at that time, the teachers considered were messianic miracles. In other words, nobody will ever be able to do these four things except for the Messiah. Remember that? Leprosy, healing leprosy was one of them. Casting out a deaf and dumb demon was impossible. Healing any birth defect, something you were born with, was impossible. And raising the dead was impossible. Those were all considered messianic. And even though they saw him do all four, they still ignored him. They saw his works. They saw his person. They saw and listened to his words and the impact of his ministry. But yet, they still misunderstood him. We've seen it, that he's divine. We see that he is human. And we see that he's willing to give us grace upon grace. Now, I want to focus on that phrase for just a second, of grace upon grace. Because I think many of us raised with the concept of Jesus forgives us our sins, and Jesus gives us mercy, and God, he is patient, and he does, and we can lose the fullness of the passion of just this grace upon grace that he gives to us. This word originally, in the original text, is hest. We won't put that one up yet, but is hest. And hest is used in multiple places in the scripture. As a matter of fact, God himself refers to himself as hest. In Exodus 20, Exodus 34, Numbers 14, Deuteronomy 5, he used the word hest as his own name. If anybody's getting those down, I'm sorry. Exodus 20. I saw that look. Exodus 34, Numbers 14, Deuteronomy 5. And as I sit here in this moment, I realize I did not make a U version this week. So, anybody look at that already knows that. Sorry about that. I was thinking I usually put those in U version, but I didn't. I didn't make that. I guess it's just my bad attitude and being out of the swing of things for the last few weeks. So, hest is a big word, and it's a word that we can't fully define. It is actually, I brought this along. I have not read this yet. This is on the list. This is a book called Inexpressible, and it's all about trying to define hest that I want to go through with it. But there is a definition, a working definition that I'll share with you that I did not come up with, but I'll share with you. That's about the closest we can define it in the English language. And now, Chris, I'll ask for your help. When the person from whom I have a right to expect nothing gives me everything. When I have a right for zero, I've earned the right for them to give me nothing, and they give me everything. And most of the time, that word in the scripture will be defined in the English as mercy or grace. Here, the translators are trying to capture, but it's not just that, it's hest. It's grace upon grace. It's more, you imagine the most grace you can possibly have, and then like double it is what they're shooting for. is that when we go with the true light and we go into the fullness of this light, that he gives us grace upon grace to the point that you don't deserve it at all. But man, does he shower it over you like the greatest waterfall you could possibly ever imagine. That's who Jesus is. That's how he responds to you. That's the love that he has for you. When the person from whom I have a right to expect nothing gives me everything. And we're going to find that Hest comes up a lot through the Gospels. Here he also talks about grace and truth. Again, he's going back to the law, about how law points out sin, but it can't solve it. That we need both of those aspects to show that love and that truth, and to proportionally embrace it. It goes back to what we've been talking about for years and years about 100% love, 100% truth, that we can't have 50-50, we can't have 95-40. There's just no mix outside of that 100%, 100%. And that's a huge backbone, not just of our ministry, but of what Christ calls us to. You might notice on Facebook this week, I made a note that it was an encouragement from somebody who works at the Billy Graham Association. When I was down there, they have this national ministry they do, that's outreach. And then when people come to the Lord, they help them plug into churches that locally within their community. And there's not a Billy Graham church in our area, not within a 15-mile radius of our church. And so I just kind of started a conversation back there, like, yeah, we'd be happy. You know, I don't expect there to be thousands of people coming through. But if somebody needs a church, or they just need to talk to a pastor for a little bit, or they just need some love, or they need some truth, we'd happy to be part of that. And so you have to go through an interview process because they don't want to send people to churches that are goofy in the wrong ways. Let's say it that way. And they tend to be, you know, pretty conservative background of things. So I had my interview with this gentleman. That's his job, is he just interviews churches for this ministry. And the questions are pretty much what I thought they would be. There's one question they should have asked that they didn't, like, how did someone become saved or come to know Jesus? But there's a lot of things as far as like what we do outreach-wise and discipleship-wise and first-time guests and all these different things. And then the last question, again, being a conservative group, was like, well, what are your beliefs on these three topics? And the three topics are abortion, homosexuality, and marriage. And so I said, well, I know what you're looking for. Here's what we believe truth-wise of it. Okay, so I know that they're going to approve us off that. But you might not approve us because the love aspect of it, depending on how you look at things. Because there's something, I love Billy Graham. You guys all know I love Billy Graham. I wear his hat around. I've got a T-shirt. I got a little Billy Graham bobblehead something. I don't. But I love Billy Graham. But there's some things within the association where some people kind of radicalize towards politic type things that I'm a little uncomfortable with or whatever. So I don't know if we're going to get approved or not. But I talked to him about the love aspect and why these things might be there. Like, yeah, for us as a church, we are pro-life, okay? And I would love, and you might have different opinions, okay? I would love for the world to be perfect, and I would love that people, you know, again, I understand why people are calling out for legal resources against abortion on over here. But I don't do that. That's not a big portion. I understand them about public, and there's a place for that or whatever. But for us, we're going to focus on adoption. And we're going to focus on helping people that are in bad situations, so abortion is not their only choice. How do we help them have resources? How do we help them have support? And the thing I shared with him, there's another church in town, they tend to, this particular pastor, he's not here anymore, he brought in politicians to speak on why abortion should be illegal. Great. Here's a poster. No. I'm not going to put that poster up. I'm going to continue to, again, look at like, you know, with the pregnancy distress and everything. But I'm not going to put a poster up. We're not going to tell my people in our church it's sinful, don't go to it. But we're not going to put that poster up in our church because some 17, 18, 19, 20, 30-year-old woman might walk in who's had abortion recently, is going through turmoil, who has questions, who's looking for the Lord, is looking for some support, and the last thing she needs is to come into our foyer and see a bright white poster with a guy in a perfect suit and a perfect smile telling her how she killed her baby and she's wrong. That's just not how we do that. I understand what they're trying to say truth-wise, but love-wise, there's got to be a tension there that makes us struggle with it. And that was the point that he said, I find that refreshing, and I don't hear that enough. And he shared about people that he has personally worked with that are same gender attracted, that have come to know Jesus, and they send them to a church, and the church closes their doors in their face. And I said, I find that sad, but not surprising. What John is talking about here is we've got to have the 100% love, we've got to have the 100% truth, not just with how we deal with others, but with how we deal with ourselves. And I think that's part that some of us have missed here at TSF. When God before something in my heart that's not right, in my actions that's not right, am I bringing 100% love and 100% truth into Tom and how he decides to work on that issue, so that I'm not just embracing one or the other, whichever one makes me at my 40%. Can you believe that they put an ego on this sucker? I mean, it's just so in depth what he has here for us, and it is purposely there for us to struggle, but in a way that brings us closer to Jesus. It brings comfort and peace and gentleness into our lives. I love Jesus, and I love that the conversations get mucky, but I love that he invites us into a solution. Here, if we're going through this today, let me ask you some questions just off of what John's talked about in his two songs. If light still overcomes darkness today, what does that mean to you if you've accepted Jesus as leader and forgiver in your life? If you haven't, and it's been because of guilt or whatever the case may be, whatever excuse there is to not accept Jesus, what does it mean to you that the light is here, the true light is there, waiting for you, ready for full hest in your direction, and all you have to do is accept it? But for Christians as well, they're living at 40, 50, 60, 70%. What does it mean that the true light overcomes darkness and you don't need to be afraid of the darkness anymore? That's profound. That should have a great impact in our lives if you want to grow in Jesus at all. What cheap lights are you embracing to keep you at 40% instead of embracing that fullness that Jesus offers to you? What's the cheap things that you're going to for comfort, for peace, for an escape, for comfortability that keeps you from that true light? Another one I wrote down was here is, do we embrace Hess as a child of God? Do we embrace it as a child of God? I don't deserve it, but man, does he give me everything. Do we embrace that? The people that John was writing to in this, they would say, man, I wish I could be like Abraham. Abraham and God, man, they had that face-to-face thing going. They got the promise there. He made some mistakes, but they had such an intimate relationship. I wish I could have that. Oh, man, you ever look at Moses and God like showing up at the tent, and he's guiding him around the desert left and right, and he's giving him extra chances. I mean, just Moses and God just was so tight. I wish I could have that kind of relationship. With David, man, David blew it big time, but immediately went back in repentance, and God himself called him one after his own heart. I just wish I could have that kind of relationship. Scripture actually tells us that those in the Old Testament days, the Old Covenant before Jesus came, wished for a day, looked forward to the day that we could have the intimacy that we have today. That we have today. You can be a hero of the faith in your own story, in your relationships and your mission fields. But we've got to get more personal with Jesus.